Excellent. Welcome to our December resource group for Start a Brewery. Thank you so much for joining us, whether now or in the future. We're super excited today to have Brynn Keenan from Grist Analytics joining us, and pretty excited to hear the background on Brynn's story. I always start out with a little bit of housekeeping in terms of format, what we're doing today. This is an interview sort of format, so we kind of learn more about Brynn and then offer her the opportunity to dive in really a little bit deeper into her best practices or tips and tricks of a topic that she chose. So excited about learning more there. We also always want to kind of reinforce our mission. Start a Brewery was created, and I know Candace is traveling today and she was bummed to miss us today. But we started with the idea that we wanted to raise the bar for startups and small breweries by education, through education, really to offer the resources for everybody to do better and be better. And through this process, we've also found that we can lower the barrier to entry for people who want to live their dream and just don't know how to get there. We're sponsored today by White Labs, so thanking Neva and her crew. Whitelabs.com is a great resource for yeast, there's a ton of library information, a lot of QA/QC information to our point today. And they do offer some yeast classes, either on site or online, and have lots of new dry yeast that they're adding to their repertoire that was previously more liquid, and just really have been innovative across their lifespan. So super appreciative of White Labs and thanking them so much for their support today. Since we are wrapping up the year, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what we've done lately that when you're obviously having lots of free time on your hands during the holidays, you might go back and look at our fourth quarter educational webinar. Fred Kaplan from Stony Hill Advisors talked about considerations before purchasing a brewery. And I know we're seeing a lot of breweries being purchased or being for sale right now. And so good advice in that zone is welcome. Our last resource group was with Emily Hutto at Radcraft. So if you want to get back into marketing and PR, you might go to our YouTube library and take a look at the November resource group. And then our last two podcast episodes for this year, our first season, we were never evers. So this was fun. We're not never evers anymore. But the last two episodes, one was your business plan and financing. Like, how much does your business plan matter? And so that was really interesting to find out from Rick Wayner and Scott Berkner, how much they look at business plans, what matters in a business plan, how to kind of tailor your business plan or set up your business plan in a way that will get the most positive effect from the bankers that you're presenting it to. And then episode 24, which was our final one, was a season wrap up. And that's just me and Candace talking about the season, talking about random things, kind of reminiscing and pulling the season to a close. And you can find the podcast wherever you find your podcasts anyway, but you can also go to the event hub on our website, and all of that information is there too. I think that's really where we are. Brynn's put her information in the chat, and we'll revisit that later too. But for now, let's dive in. So Brynn, if you'll introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do when you're not in beer world.
Yeah, I'm Brynn Keenan. I'm the founder of Grist Analytics. I formerly managed QA, QC at Inland Island Yeast Labs, and before that, Left Hand Brewing. So I've been in brewing quality control for basically my whole career. When I'm not in beer, I am a rock climber. So I spend a lot of time rock climbing, trail running, just pretty active in the outdoors, really. So that takes up most of my time outside of work.
So you're in the lab or outdoors? There's not much in between.
Yeah, pretty much that. Yeah.
Colorado's a great place to do that.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
So when you're working with clients, help me understand, what problems do you solve? It sounds like maybe there's more than one. So what's the scope of what Grist Analytics does?
Sure. So at its heart, we're a data management platform built for production. So we're an ERP platform is built for accounting, inventory, kind of business management. Grist is built for production management. So you start using it when you start brewing, you stop using it when you finish packaging, and we track all of the data in between, analyze all of that data, return it to users in real time with statistical feedback on how they're doing. So it reduces variation from the start of the production process and gives people a set of tools to diagnose and troubleshoot issues as they arise. So really creates a quality control program or quality assurance program from the data that most breweries are already collecting. And we have a few different types of users who use Grist. So on the production side, really the problem we're solving is giving them the autonomy to do that root cause analysis, giving them a place to look up historical data. We make scheduling in the cellar much more efficient. There's a bunch of predictive scheduling tools. So scheduling in the cellar can be really difficult without more predictive fermentation tools. And on the ownership side, which is kind of like where we're focusing today, there's often a real disconnect between ownership and the actual production in the brewery. Like the brewer is kind of in charge of production, the owner's in charge of the business side, depending on the model of the brewery. And we're really trying to help bridge that gap between production and business management, because they're really interconnected, and oftentimes we look at them as separate things.
And one dictates the other sometimes, and if you're not listening.
Yeah, exactly. Or knowing what to ask. It feels like two different worlds, and we're calling things different things that are kind of the same thing. So yeah, figuring out like what tethers, push and pull from both sides.
Right. Do you find that you're doing some troubleshooting on the fly, like as the brewing process is happening and as the packaging process is happening? Are people literally looking at the software and saying, hey, something's wrong, like we're out of whack? Or is it more afterwards and you're looking backwards to troubleshoot?
Yeah, that's a great question. A little bit of both. Primarily real time. So on the brew deck, they're getting statistical alerts if one of their measurements is outside of normal deviation or outside of their range. So there's the opportunity to correct things before they become issues. So that's kind of like real-time preventative. And we'll often see that just from seeing the data when it's being collected, a natural reduction in variation from all of your brew house measurements and cellar measurements in real time. In packaging, we also have some like stop, start metrics. So if something's out of spec, you can stop what you're doing and take care of it. And there's kind of another suite of retrospective diagnostic tools.
Gotcha. And is the brewing team inputting data as they go and then it's being analyzed, or do you have equipment that actually does some of that measurement on its own?
Yeah, right now it's all manually entered. That's usually what people want it for. We can bring in data and automate it. Usually the automated data that brewers have access to is like in a loop. So temperature data is being taken, and that's controlling like how much glycol is sent to a tank. And it's not quite as actionable as the data that they're taking manually on the brew deck. So we focus on that stuff, but we can always look at integrating hardware data too.
To get there.
Mm-hmm.
So many questions. I'll keep asking. So how did you first get involved in craft beer? So tell us your story.
Yeah, so I went to college for biochemistry, and I was initially planning to go to med school, and decided not to do that. And I was going instead and shadowing in a bunch of PhD labs my senior year in college, and I was going to start applying to programs, but I just like the lab felt so stuffy, and for some reason it just felt like the wrong thing to do, and I kind of started to fall for craft beer and fall in love with it. So I went around to all the breweries in town and asked if I could intern, because I just kind of had this feeling that it's what I wanted to do instead of going through more school. And I ended up interning at this brewery, just like kind of washing kegs before class every day, and fell in love with it. And it was really before breweries had a lot of quality control programs, at least in craft brewing. Obviously, like Macro did. And when I graduated, they wanted me to come on full time and build a lab out for their brewery, which I ended up not doing because I moved to Colorado, and that was in South Carolina. But I just kept going with it. I moved out to Colorado because there's climbing there, there's beer there. I didn't have a job yet, and I got a job as a lab tech at Left Hand, and I became the lab manager, the QC manager, and learned a ton throughout that process. So I guess it just kind of pulled me when I was in school, and I've been doing it ever since.
So the lab felt different when it was in a brewery.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And biochemistry, it's like there's just so much to it that you can't really do anything cool until you go get a PhD. And I think what was among many things, what was cool about working in a brewery lab is like it felt like I was doing graduate level research and making these significant contributions in like more of a startup, like scrappy, reading everything you can get your hands on, kind of assimilating all of this different information because it's an underdeveloped field, really, or at least it was in craft beer at the time. So it was like, yeah, I guess it felt good to have more autonomy and feel like I could make a bigger difference faster.
Right. And you're developing and creating it on your own, like make it be what you want it to be.
Yeah, and I think we all
Pioneer.
feel that way to some extent in beer
Yeah.
is like wanting some agency.
You're a pioneer instantly. So what was your first beer that you enjoyed?
Oh man. Gosh, that was a long time ago. The let's see. This is funny, but like that, yeah, it's like not my style at all anymore. Though I'm sure it's still like I haven't had this beer, or I don't even know if it's around. But the first beer I remember really loving was the Rogue had like a nut brown ale or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was like the first craft beer I had in college. Where I was like, this is awesome. Which tastes have changed since then, but
Well, that's one more ingredient to your shift.
for sure.
Direction that made some sense. All right. So what's the coolest project you've ever worked on related to the brewing industry, and what was your role in it?
Yeah, so I guess I was thinking I have one before. There's kind of like pre-grist and post-grist. Grist in and of itself is probably the coolest project I've I've worked at. Building the company of grist has been the coolest one. There was another project when I was at Left Hand when we started canning nitro cans. So Left Hand had been canning nitro bottles for a long time. And then we were, I think, one of the first breweries to start using the ball nitro cans. And we did just this massive experiment to figure out like the right concentration of CO2 and nitrogen and how to do it and how to prepare it and how to can it. And it was just this massive data collection effort. And then I feel like we nailed it. It took a couple of months to figure it out, and then it just ran so smoothly, and that was a really cool thing to be a part of. And then obviously like building Grist and yeah, there have been a couple of features in Grist like in general, the concept of taking a bunch of data, giving it to people in a format that they can use it, and allowing them to investigate it in a very simple way without overwhelming them are just dials to flexibility and ease of use that are really difficult to get right. So every project that we have like that in Grist, where we're visualizing data and trying to guess what people want to see and when they want to see it, has been really cool.
Yeah, I imagine. And my background is computer science, and one of the things I did when I was working grad school in AI was what is intuitive? And it sounds to me a little bit like the same thing, like what is going to be intuitive to people? How do they want to see it? And some people are visual and some people are charts and some, yeah. How do you present that? And how does
Oh
everyone
yeah, for sure.
process that?
I
And
didn't know that was your background too. That's really
yeah,
cool.
yeah, I always say artificial intelligence was great for tourism because then I moved to Vail and there's no intelligence left when people check in on, they're traveling with their family all day from wherever and they show up exhausted and there's nothing left. So it's like perfect preparation for me for checking tourists into hotels, right? But
Yeah.
you guys nailed the percentages for left-hand milk stout nitro to the point where they developed a glass for it, right? I mean, the model for the stout glass that Spiegelau did was your beer. I mean, there's a whole lot of accolades to left-hand milk stout nitro being the first beer that actually makes that work on the craft side. So huge
Yeah.
kudos. I think it's been on every single retail program menu list that I've ever put together, which is a number of lists. So this
Yeah,
might
I
get you.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was one of the coolest things about it is like my predecessors had developed the nitro bottle and it felt really cool to kind of like it felt like an important legacy to be able to continue with the nitro cans. And yeah, it was a proud accomplishment to not let them down.
Well, and you also did Left Hand did as a marketing push, and Eric did such a great job of we're not telling you how it works.
Yeah.
You just need to learn how to pour it properly. All
Yeah,
right, how
for
about the
sure.
most complex or problematic project? Is that the same?
Yeah, I think that really gets at the yeah, to with like the question with what's intuitive, it's interesting how not intuitive guessing what is intuitive
Yes, yes.
is when we first started building data analysis features in Grist, my MO was really, okay, we're going to build a feature for data analysis, and I want this feature to be able to do as many things as it possibly can, because we're putting the work into this and people are going to have different things that they want out of this feature. So we're just going to like make it as customizable as possible, which is really one of the tenets of Grist, is that it's totally flexible. And all of those options really just kept people from using those features to their fullest extent because there's a learning curve. You see a lot of options. They kind of got to get in there and figure out how to use it. So taking those features and redesigning them to have all of the same options, but a simpler flow to get from one question to the next. So instead of here's a tool, figure out what you need to know on your own, being like, okay, what's the first question going to be? Once I have this data, what's the next question going to be? Okay, now that they have that, like, then what do they need to know? And the pivot to that way of thinking is, I think, is a constant challenge for all of us, but a really fun one.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. Do you do a lot of consumer feedback polling to see how your people think of it? Like, did you nail it?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we've got some data too, so we can see like how often people are using something or like how like the bounce rate on a page. Like, so if people are going to check out an analysis feature and then they're leaving really quickly, then we know like they're not finding
Overwhelmed.
what they need
Yes.
in it. Yeah, so we do some feedback polling on it, and we were getting so much closer now. Yeah, it was good, it was good to begin with, but people are really using those features a lot more now than they were initially, which has been cool. And the analytics say that too.
Good. Good. That is cool that you have data on your data. Data program to analyze data.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. All right. So give us your 5 best practices. I'm really excited to learn here today.
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned earlier that like this the transition between production and ownership can kind of be, it can usually be a tenuous one, especially if it's a non-technical owner and a technical brewer. There can be such a knowledge gap there. They sort of have to trust whatever one person is saying to the other. And I'm sure there's data that the head brewer or the production manager would want from ownership that that they're not getting, that transparency that would help them do their job. So this is bi-directional. But right now I'm talking about the production data that an owner would want to see and kind of best practices around that. So the first one is quality control versus quality assurance.
Okay.
So quality control is often what we think of when we think of a brewery lab. So IBU testing and diacetyl testing and finished gravity and sensory results. But those are really just telling us if we did a good job or if we did a bad job. They're not necessarily increasing the quality of the product. They're just letting us know if the quality is good or bad. And that's quality control. And quality assurance is the ability to control that. So quality assurance and having a QA program is knowing which variables influence the finished diacetyl level in a beer and controlling those variables.
Okay.
So that's just like my first key takeaway to kind of set the stage for the others is knowing the difference between those two and knowing which quality control points are important. So what means that the production process was good? What is a good job? And what does that include? So my second one is, okay, so what quality control points are important for an owner to know? And I've wrapped in quality control with efficiency and consistency, since those are usually what owners like really care about, and they are influenced by all of the QC points that make good quality beer. So those would be brewhouse efficiency and brewhouse duration. So brewhouse efficiency means how much extract do we get from our raw materials and how much volume do we get from this brew. So, and that's just a calculation that you can look up. It's pretty easy to calculate. If you need help calculating it, you can reach out to me. It's a super important metric that tells you how your brew house is performing. We will often see breweries vary 10 to 15% in the volume that they're producing per turn in the brew house. So even on a 10-barrel system, it's like a barrel to a 1.5 barrels. That's a ton of money. That's, potentially 3 kegs of beer that every turn is variable. And how much can you sell 3 kegs of beer through the tap room through? That's an enormous amount of variation. So knowing how you're looking on brew house efficiency, which has to do with volume and extract, is critical.
So what kind of variables do you think cause that to change?
Yeah, exactly. So that would be like the quality control point, and the quality assurance points on that are mash pH, mash temperature, water duration,
Okay.
boil length, if you're diluting to gravity, how much it's being diluted, final runnings gravity, final runnings pH. So how much are you pulling and how much are you leaving? In the first vessel once you're in the kettle. Those would be some critical QA points for that QC point.
Gotcha. Awesome.
Yeah, just generally the stuff that's already on the brew log that's already being tracked, but trending it over time so you can see if those are consistent.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, the next one is brew house duration. So how long is it taking to brew a beer? In a small operation, like how long it takes to brew a beer and get it into the cellar is a pain point for the brewer. It could be a short day or a long day that keeps you from doing other stuff. But as a brewery grows and you start to bring on help and you start to do multiple turns in a day, it's actually a really critical point for how much you're spending on labor and just quality of life for brewers in the brew house too, how long these things are taking. And that would be the QC point. The QA points would be mashing duration, watering duration, kettle duration, whirlpool duration, transfer duration. Like, are you getting stuck waters all the time? What can you do to fix those stuck waters? Anything that controls how long those things are taking in the brew house.
Gotcha. Okay.
In the cellar, so cellar throughput is one we talk about all the time. So you have 10 tanks in the cellar. If you're a brewery that's limited on tank capacity, maybe you're new and you don't have as many tanks as you'd like, getting those beers through those tanks as quickly as possible means that you can make more with fewer capital expenses. Yeah, which is a lot of breweries that exist now have more capacity than they need. But for a new brewery that's starting up, I think you have the opportunity to dial that in a little bit better. We often associate long fermentation times with craft beer, but long fermentation times aren't good for beer quality either. Cutting it short's not good, but a beer that's taking 300 hours to finish is going to have issues with yeast autolysis. It's likely unhealthy yeast. How long it takes a beer to ferment tells you a lot about beer quality. And if it's much longer or much shorter than a benchmark average for that yeast strain, you're probably going to see some degradation on quality on either side. It also makes it much more difficult to brew to order for distributors, makes production planning really difficult, and it's really actionable. If your fermentation is super long or super short, we know how to fix that. There are defined variables that influence fermentation time. So it's a solvable problem. All of these QC points are.
Good.
Yeah, and then I've also got percent volume lost in the cellar. So we just released a feature in Grist that lets you dial into volume loss, and I've been shocked to see the volume loss numbers in the breweries. And this, at first, I thought the feature was broken to see how much volume is being lost in breweries in the cellar and how variable it is. It's just so much beer that's going down the drain. And I know that, you're bound to lose some volume in the cellar, but tracking how much volume lost is going on in the cellar and where that volume is being lost, if you have like a trouble beer where you're always losing more volume than the other, if it's being lost in normal transfers, or if it's being lost during centrifuging, maybe there's something you can do to dial in your centrifuge so you're losing less beer. These things are really important to track. And in a bigger brewery, honestly, like an owner is going to be much more invested in how much volume is being lost in the cellar than people who are, overworked, oftentimes underpaid, trying to get things done. And it's just like another thing on the to-do list. So not saying, that production doesn't care about volume loss, but production ownership probably cares more about it.
It transfers to dollars on the ownership side. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then in packaging, so pack time to barrels. So how fast is beer getting packaged? And again, in a super small operation, long packaging times and downtime is painful, but it doesn't become super expensive. And then as you start hiring people on to help with those things and outsourcing those tasks, that can become really expensive if packaging isn't running smoothly. There may be things you can do to dial in equipment. Maybe there's like some human error that's leading to long packaging times and loss, and that stuff is critical to track from dollars in, dollars out perspective too, along with packaging volume loss. So how much loss is happening for different pack types.
Some of that's inevitable for packaging, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And what I look for in our data for packaging loss too is inconsistencies. So we lost a ton of beer on this day, but not as much beer on this day. So what was the difference between these 2 days? Maybe it was unavoidable, but what can we learn about the day with low packaging loss versus the day with high packaging loss? Like what happened that day and how can we avoid it again?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Packaging is an interesting variable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, but all of those things, and I've got some, I came prepared to, talk more about like these KPIs that relate to these, what I view as quality KPIs that relate to, how much money a brewery is bringing in. There are also like unrelated quality control KPIs too that I would add to that, like Are you seeing contaminations? That's probably the most important one on top of this. That has the highest consequence for if it goes wrong. So getting beer at least spot checked for micro, and making sure there's no super hyper attenuating yeast in it. There's no lacto, there's no PDO. There are a few big trouble organisms that you want to make sure are not in your beers.
Is that mostly microscope work, or is there more of a chemical analysis that goes with that?
More so diastaticus, it's microscope work, but more so like media work. So for diastaticus, the best way to detect it is by making an agar plate of a nutrient agar called LCSM.
Okay.
That inhibits all other types of yeast and bacteria besides diastaticus, which is a hyperattenuating yeast. And you'd plate your beer on it and then incubate it and see if anything grows. So you actually don't even need to put it under a microscope. It's just making it, plating it, and seeing the results afterwards. PDO and lacto is even easier. They make a media called HLP that doesn't require an autoclave like making LCSM does. So it's an even cheaper, lower hanging fruit test to do.
Right.
And that one you just inject beer into HLP media and look for growth after a few days.
Interesting. And so you would do those tests after brewing was complete, yes?
Yeah, you do those tests usually after packaging is complete. You can do them after brewing is complete too, in the fermenter, and then you have a little bit more time to respond.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, good to know what those what the KPIs are that you're supposed to be looking at.
Yeah. Yeah, and then third takeaway is KPIs are great, but if you don't know what influences them, it's really just stressful. So if
All right.
So I like, why put yourself through the pain? You know, it's good to know, but if you're not committed to like finding out what's influencing these things, like it's painful. You know, it sucks to know that you're losing a ton of volume in the cellar. And if you have no ability to diagnose why you're losing a ton of volume in the cellar, then all you're doing is stressing yourself out.
Right.
So yeah. So that's my next takeaway is like, you got to start tracking these things to see how you're doing on them, because like intuition is not going to cut it, you know, like you need to like plot them and track them over time so you can see how they're changing week to week. And then when you see something that you would like to influence, that's a whole nother process of figuring out which variables influence that KPI and tracking those. So you asked about cellar, well, you asked about brew house efficiency earlier. I have some examples for cellar throughput. So
Okay.
cellar throughput doesn't sound like a quality control KPI. It sounds like a, you know, production process KPI, but to control cellar throughput, okay, like what's the biggest thing that influences cellar throughput? And that's probably fermentation time. So
Okay.
it's like, okay, we can't really control fermentation time still. That's still like a big looming thing that's hard to influence. What are the biggest things that influence fermentation time? Okay, that might be cell count and viability of the yeast that's pitched into that beer. So, okay, maybe those are two tests that we need to invest in, like how many cells are going in and how many of those cells are alive. And that's just microscope work. It's a pretty cheap test to take. So, okay, what if we start taking those and viability looks horrible? So that's still a difficult one. And what factors influence viability? Mostly storage conditions. And now you've worked it back to a point where you've gotten it to a really actionable set of things. Like, how are we storing this yeast? Maybe we can reach out to a friend that's been doing this for a long time and like run it past them, tell them how we're storing this yeast, see what they have to say about it. Like asking why until you get to something that you could possibly control.
That makes sense. Does Grist, well, it sounds like it's integrated in some level, but are you offering testing through the yeast propagation process of things?
Yeah, everything that's numerical in Grist is control charted and tracked. So if a brewery is collecting data, it's in Grist and they can go back and look at those control charts. So yeah, all the data is in there and analyzed to facilitate that continuous improvement process.
Does that also, are other ingredients tracked, like what kind of malt you got and what the different statistical analysis of that is when you get it and how that factors in? Is that part of it too?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Awesome.
you can track it. You can just keep asking why.
Okay. All right. All
And
right.
maybe it leads you back to the raw material supplier.
There's a place in Grist to record anything you want to measure, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. My next takeaway here is data doesn't matter if no one's looking at it. So a weekly KPI meeting, and like even if you aren't to the point where you have all those intermediate variables, you're not like ready to ask why. If you're tracking these main KPIs, like it's really easy to not look at that data, but a weekly meeting to look at how that data is trending over time can do wonders. It's amazing how much we see in just wild swings and critical performance KPIs. People just weren't looking at them. So getting together, once a week, maybe once a month, and taking a look at the data.
Is that mostly just brew team or owners too? What do you recommend there?
I recommend everybody in the brewery, so a representative from each department that each has maybe in the beginning 3 KPIs from their department that they think encapsulate the most important things about what they do, and bring those to the meeting, present them, and if something needs more investigation, then that's what their action item is until the next meeting.
Okay, got it. That makes sense.
Yeah, and then the 5th one, the final one, is change doesn't happen fast. So, that process of, okay, fermentation times are long. We've got to ask why until we find something that's controllable. Maybe you don't even have some of that data. And maybe it's not in a format that you can view it over time. Maybe you need to get it into Excel, or you need to start using something like Grist, or you could start using Google Sheets, or like any way to keep your data in a tabular format and trend and track it over time. I mean, that in and of itself is going to take some work. And then implementing any testing you don't have is going to take some work. So I feel like it's really easy to get caught up in wanting to improve everything at once, but a little prioritization, knowing that like nothing happens overnight, and you can really only work on one thing at a time realistically in a brewery when everybody's busy and doing 1,000 things.
Yeah. So if you're starting at 0 in systems and KPIs and testing, where would you start in terms of what are the most important or maybe most low-hanging fruit that makes the biggest difference elements? Where would you begin with that?
Yeah, I would. So everybody's got all of this data, and the ones that I mentioned earlier. So brewhouse efficiency, cellar throughput, volume out of the cellar, percent volume lost in the cellar, and percent volume lost in packaging. Those are great places to start. And then keeping those in an Excel sheet versus a paper log. So maybe you're using a paper log to record that data. Instead of a paper log, maybe just keeping a row column format in Excel, so you can trend and track those things over time. It's not a ton of data to be recording a double entry of. You can use something like Grist and we'll automate all that stuff for you, so you don't have to do like all that data entry. But if you're new and you're on a budget and you're not looking for software yet, just taking those most critical metrics off of your paper logs and putting them in an Excel sheet so you can trend them over time and just a scatter plot.
Yeah. And like you said, sometimes it's not necessarily what the value is, but how different they are from batch to batch to batch to see what's outlying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And if you also, if you have your data in that format, it becomes much easier to, yeah, we're mostly worried about the deviation from batch to batch to batch. We're
Right.
also worried about like, is this up to like the benchmarking average in the industry? Like, are you losing much more volume than your brewery next door? And if you have the data in that format where you are trending it over time, it becomes really easy to call somebody like me or any other, quality or production consultant in the industry and give them the data that they need to tell you if it looks good or it looks bad and what needs to change.
Gotcha. Are there also places to look like ASBC or other places that might give some of that data as a standard?
So we have a bunch of benchmarking data in Grist. So, and we haven't published it yet. We give it to our users. So if anybody ever has a question about benchmarking, feel free to shoot me a message and I can try and help you out. There's not a lot of production benchmarking out there, really. There have been some talks. The NBAA is a great resource for like each one individually. Like you can find some stuff on what a normal brew house efficiency looks like, but there aren't great benchmarking stats as far as I know. If somebody else has different information, I'd love to see them.
Yeah. Awesome. So kind of a random question. When people are talking about different ways to do QA QC, I know one of the things that's brought up is you can ship your beer out for testing. This sounds different than what you're talking about because you're talking about monitoring the brewing process throughout. What's
Mhm.
similar or different? Are those two completely separate concepts?
No, so usually when people are sending beer out for quality, I highly recommend it for new breweries. So those would be like your main quality control points. Like they'll usually test to make sure there's no bacteria. They'll test to make sure there's no wild yeast. They'll test your alcohol. They'll test your IBUs, and maybe they'll test diacetyl levels. And those are pretty much the only things, and like finishing pH. So those like would be like the main endpoint QC metrics that a lab would test for you. Grist is taking all of the QA points along the way and the QC points. So we would track those as well. Like if a brewery's testing them or if they're having those done by an external lab, those would be recorded in Grist and we'll track them over time. But yeah, we're collecting and tracking like all of the values that brewers are collecting on the beer as they're brewing, all the values that they're collecting as they're cellaring, and all the values that they're collecting as they're packaging, which are really the data points where they can control those
Right.
final metrics that the lab's giving them.
And if you're shipping it out, that's the end result of all the things that were measured in the process.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
and if you're measuring all that data, you probably know if you have an issue. But ultimately, if you sent it out and they said, you have XYZ that is out of whack or a wild yeast or something that's screwing up your world, you can probably see that reflected in the data that you're recording. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. We just a couple of months ago, we caught a diastaticus contamination from the data before it was tested in a lab. So a lot of that stuff you can see. And like, for example, a diastaticus contamination will lead to really long trickling fermentation curves. So in the data, when I see attenuation go up, fermentation time go long, and long trickling fermentation curves, I'm like, well, this is either hot creep or diastaticus.
Gotcha. And then you have some steps. Once you identify the problem, then you can take the steps.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
By that.
Yeah,
So
micro is a little trickier because that's really an important one to have like that final those yeah the for micro, like an internal micro program is I think like maybe the most important investment that a brewery can make to their quality control program, because you can tell some of that in the data, but you really need to be taking those micro results throughout the process if you don't want to end up with the final product that's spoiled and not know how it happened.
So that's taking samples throughout and then either testing it chemically or looking in the microscope, depending on what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, plating it on those nutrient medias.
Right.
that selectively grow spoilers.
Gotcha. And at what stages is that mostly fermentation testing? Or is that also like as you create the wort and as that before it even moves into the fermenter, are you testing it there too?
Yeah, the best QA points for a micro program are testing wort when it leaves the brew house, and that's just a sterile jar of wort that gets incubated, and you look for you look for anything growing. So if it smells bad or if it produces a bunch of CO2 over the course of a few days in an incubator. The next point would be the first 24 hours of fermentation for aerobic and anaerobic spoilers. Testing the yeast pitch for spoilers, and testing in the last 24 hours of fermentation, and testing in cans and bottles would be the QA points for micro.
Gotcha. So how many variables do you remove that could cause problems when you do a freshly purchased batch of yeast if you purchase yeast for every batch, how many of those contamination or problematic areas are you eliminating? None?
Just one, really. Just the, well, I mean, it eliminates quite a few. So like if you're fermenting a beer and you're cropping yeast into a yeast brink and you're repitching it into something else, the contamination points are the pipe, the yeast brink, and the pipe to the new beer, and all of the oxygen that's going in potentially to propagate that yeast if that's happening, or any of the storage conditions in the yeast brink. So it eliminates that whole element as a contamination point. It also, there can be contamination points at the yeast supplier too. So, it gets rid of some, but you still gotta keep an eye on pitch quality, even if it's directly from the yeast supplier.
Right. And do you see a difference in possible contamination for dry versus liquid yeast?
I don't know much about that, to be honest. For some reason, I feel like I heard that there was, well, I shouldn't say that because I just don't know a whole lot about it. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what somebody from White Labs or Escarpment like has to say about I'm not sure. I at some point heard that it was more likely to get a contamination from dry yeast, but I think that was like at the beginning of the dry yeast evolution, and I think that's probably been tightened up now.
Right. That would make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. I feel like there's so many variables in how you treat, harvest, propagate all of the yeast pieces. I don't know that that's necessarily more or less than issues that could come up with hops, issues that could come up with malt, but I feel like the yeast is so much more alive and living that it should have more variable.
It definitely does. It's a huge potential source for contamination, definitely, especially if a brewery is like handling it and using it for many generations. Absolutely, ordering yeast, if you don't have a micro program in-house, ordering yeast more often is a great way to avoid potential contamination.
Gotcha. So in terms of hops or malt, particularly with hops, now that there's so many different ways that hops are packaged and or oil, do you see any variable there in terms of what's safer, I guess, for the beer?
Yeah, I don't normally associate any form of hops with more with beer, introducing beer spoilers. But definitely extract would have less of a possibility of introducing organisms. Hops will introduce organisms to the beer, but they're usually not beer spoilers. They're usually aerobic organisms that can't live in beer because there's not much oxygen.
Right. And would you say that fresh hop then is going to have more variable than anything that's been frozen? That would make sense, right?
I would think so. Yeah, more variable quality in general, I would think. But yeah, hops aren't. I'll say that my area of expertise really lies more like on the is not in hops. So I'd be curious to, that's my opinion, but I'd be curious to hear what somebody who studies hops thinks.
Gotcha. Is malt the least contributive to issues?
Yes, it is the least contributive to issues. Yeah, because it's added before the boil, so you wouldn't normally see a spoiler come in from grain.
Because it's been boiled.
Yeah, but malt can be one of the biggest sources of variation in the beer. So not a huge source for contamination, but a big source for variation in consistency.
Right. And from my limited experience, I would say you're supposed to pay attention to analysis of the malt each time to know if you have variability from batch to batch.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of those things that it's like if you're struggling with brew house efficiency and you go through all those whys, you may end up back at the malt certificate of analysis, looking at what's changed with the malt. If nothing in between your result and the malt has seen a ton of variation. Usually at breweries, the brewing process is so variable that they wouldn't be able to see, at least the result of variation in the malt would be muted from the amount of variation in their own process. So any amount that they can reduce that variation allows them to see clearly when the malt is influencing their process.
Right. The tighter controls you have on the more streamlined and efficient and measurable everything else is.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, Kevin, anything you want to throw in? I've kind of run us almost to the end. I'm hoping that you would have said something if you had questions, but we have time if you're there and you'd like some.
No, actually do not. This was just a big learning experience for me, and I feel like I know little to no questions right now.
Gotcha. That's
So
also a big learning experience for me. I just keep asking random questions.
That was great. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'll go ahead and do a wrap up here. I wanted to first of all, Brynn, thank you so much for making time, answering questions and offering all of your wisdom. And I thank you, Kevin, for coming. I appreciate that. And thanks to White Labs so much for sponsoring these. We really appreciate the support to be able to offer this kind of information in our library and to those who are attending live. So whitelabs.com, if you want to reach White Labs. And Brynn, would you once again tell us how to reach you if somebody had questions for Grist or for you?
Yeah, I'm Brynn at gristanalytics.com. So feel free to reach out.
And that's BRYNN, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I hope everybody has a wonderful holiday season. We'll look forward to seeing you in 2024. And yeah, thank you. Have a wonderful
Awesome. Yeah, happy holidays, Laura and Kevin.
thank you.
See ya.